Hey guys, David with Liguori Drag Racing, and you just bought a FuelTech. What's the next step? So let's get familiar with the harness. I have a lot of questions about wiring, and a lot of guys are afraid to wire themselves. So let's go over the harness. Quick overview of the harness. Going to go through several questions that I get, so hopefully I can answer it for you. So let's get into it. I'm going to open it up. This harness is the FT450 harness and the FT550A harness. So we're going to set this aside right now. This is the FT550B harness. So on the A harness, if you buy a 450 and you run out of inputs, run out of outputs, and you need more, you don't have to rewire your bike to buy a 550, because the 550 will plug right in, fire right up just like your 450 did. So you have 6 blue outputs on a 450, and blue outputs are for things such as fuel injectors, solenoids, activating things by ground like a relay, shift solenoid, activating a fuel pump with a relay, activating a nitrous solenoid with a relay, activating a thermatic fan with a relay, things such as that. So that's blue output. You have 6 of them on a 450, you have 12 of them on a 550. So there's 6 more in this harness. So now that we got blues separated and we know what blues do, blue output, commonly used blue output number 1 for fuel injector number 1. I recommend going through and making sure you have enough outputs for everything that you need. For example, if you have 4 injectors on, say, a Gen 1 Hayabusa, you want a blue wire to go to each. Okay, that means you have 2 left over. You have 5 and 6 left over. This can be used for a gear shift output. It can be used for a fuel pump output. What if you don't have enough? Say you run a nitrous bike, okay? Now you need to get a little bit more creative. You take blue number 1 and you can pair it with a injector number 4. So blue number 1 would go with injector 1 and injector 4. Blue number 2 output would go to injector 2 and 3. Now if you have a 550, you don't need to worry about that. You can have a Gen 2 Hayabusa with 8 injectors and not have to pair any of them, for example. If you pair injectors together, that would give you 2 more outputs that you can control a nitrous solenoid or a thermatic fan. You have 4 ignition outputs. Ignition outputs are gray wires, gray 1 through 4 on the A harness. If you have a 4-cylinder motorcycle with 4 separate coils, you would wire these individually, and these would go to a Spark Pro 4 box. We'll go over the Spark Pro 4 harness in another video, but the Spark Pro 4 has 4 gray wires on it as well, and you would splice these into each other. So gray to gray on the ECU to the Spark Pro 4. Now if you are using smart coils, these would go directly to the smart coil. Smart coils have a built-in igniter. 2-pin coils such as factory motorcycle coils, Hayabusa ZX14 coils. They are called dumb coils. They don't have a built-in igniter. Outputs, or inputs, sorry. You have 7 inputs on a 450. An input is anything that goes into the ECU, such as a sensor or a switch or a button. So you have throttle position sensor, you have oil pressure, you have engine temp, drive shaft speed, two-step button or clutch switch, upshift button. That all needs a white input wire. A white input, when sent 5 volts on a oil pressure sensor or fuel pressure, nitrous pressure, same deal. It reads back a certain voltage. So you send it 5 volts and it sends back a voltage within the white wires to give you a pressure. So you have 7 of those on a 450A harness. You have 7 more on a B harness for a 550. You have a red wire, switch 12 volts. I'll go over switch 12 volts in a later video. Switch 12 volts in itself can take up a lot of time. You have 2 black wires, ground wires. Everything goes back to the battery. Battery negative. Everything. I can't stress that enough. Every ground that you have, back to the battery. Your 5 volts. There's only 1 wire for 5 volts, okay? But it can be spliced up to as many times as you want. You can have 1,000 sensors on it. You have to splice this wire. Or you have to figure out a way to branch them off from each other, such as a terminal block that's jumpered together. Every ECU that I know only has 1 or 2 of these, and people always ask me, why is there only 1 wire? Well, there's only so much room in an ECU that you can take up. So you take this wire and you splice it. It's a green wire with a red stripe. That is your 5 volt signal wire. Oil pressure sensors, fuel pressure, nitrous pressure, shock travel sensor, some speed sensors such as a factory ZX14 or a factory Hayabusa Suzuki speed sensor can get a 5 volt signal. Every one of those signals, every one of those sensors needs a ground, a battery ground. The 450 does not have a sensor ground in it, okay? The A harness does not for a 450. You have to get that from the battery. You can splice them all from 1 wire. So you take 1 wire from the battery, negative, and you can splice it out to all your sensors. Now, if you get a 550 and you have a B harness, the B harness does have a sensor ground wire into it. We'll open this up in a minute. CAN communication. CAN A is on the A harness here. This you plug into your O2 Nano. Most kits that I sell, everything gets a O2 Nano. Some kits get a EGT4. EGT4s also plug into the CAN plug. The CAN is a 2-wire twisted pair that feeds information back and forth, and it talks to the ECU from those components, say an O2 Nano or an EGT4. So those talk back to each other. O2 Nano EGT4 does not take up an input. So you can have 4 EGTs, does not take up 4 inputs. Super nice, because with 7 inputs on a 450, 14 inputs on a 550, doesn't take up any information, doesn't take up any inputs. Now you have two black shielded cable wires. The smaller one with just a singular white wire in it that is shielded with a bare wire. Let me see if I can open this up a little bit. So you can see that there is a shielded wire in there, bare shielded wire. This is your cam input. Your cam input on a 2-wire sensor. You take this white wire and you take it to one of the pins on the cam sensor, and you take the shield and you can run the shield as the other pin. So if it's 2-wire, you can use this white wire as a signal. You can use the bare wire as the ground. If you want to run a separate ground so there's not a bare wire there, you can, but you don't have to. If it's a 3-wire Hall effect sensor, such as on a Gen 2 Hayabusa, you can also use this as the ground, the signal, and I suggest using a 12-volt signal to it. You can use 5 volts, I recommend 12. If you want to run a separate ground wire on a 3-wire sensor, you can do that as well. Now, we'll get to the last of the 450 and 550A harness, the crank sensor wiring. This is a black cable as well, shielded with a white and a red wire in it, with a bare shielded wire, just like the cam. So you have a bare wire, a red, and a white. On your crank sensor, if you have a Hayabusa, if you have a ZX14, if you have a GSX-R 1000, or anything with a 2-wire plug, that is a VR sensor. VR sensor only gets 2 wires. You connect your red wire to one, connect your white wire to the other, and in a later video I'm going to be doing an install on a Hayabusa, and I'm going to show you what wires go to what connector. When using a VR sensor, you do not have to terminate the shielded wire on either the cam or the crank. Don't connect them to anything, okay? When using a Hall effect sensor, 3-wire sensor, such as a MPS crank trigger from for a KZ or a GS, those are 3-wire Hall effect sensors. I sell a KZ crank trigger that is a 3-wire sensor. You do not use the white wire, okay, on a 3-wire sensor. So the white wire we will just cut off, okay? You can use the bare wire as the ground as long as you run both of your black wires from the ECU directly to the battery, which you should, because I'm telling you, you should. The red wire is your signal wire. It would go to the signal wire on the sensor. A Hall effect sensor needs a battery ground, which is your bare wire, or a separate insulated wire from the battery ground, and a 12-volt wire. I always recommend using 12 volts on Hall effect sensors, except maybe a speed sensor on a Hayabusa or a ZX14, GSX-R, things like that. They seem to work good with 5 volts. Crank triggers and cam sensors always work better on 12 volts from what I've found. Any Hall effect sensor, the ground must go to the battery. If you run it to the chassis, if you splice it into other grounds, something like that, you will have, there's no maybe, you will have a crank trigger error. And I can't stress it enough to go directly to the battery with every single ground that you have. I don't care if you have 10 wires on it. I don't care if you have 30 wires on it. I don't care if you have 100 wires on it. You do not need to run 50, 20, whatever it is, how many wires to one single eyelet and have 20 eyelets on your battery. You can run all of those wires and strip all those wires down, crimp one single terminal on as many wires as you can put into that terminal, and put that on the battery. So maybe you have 1 or 2 eyelets on the battery. As long as they are spliced together on the battery lug, they are fine. So let's wrap up this A harness for the 450 and the 550A harness. If you look on the back of your ECU for the 450, the 550, it has A and B labeled on it. So let's set this to the side and open up the B harness for a 550. .550 harness is pretty simple. It is mixed with inputs and outputs as well. On a 550, you have 12 blue outputs, including the A harness. So you have 6 on that. You have 6 on this B harness. You have 4 more ignition outputs. Now, if you're working on a motorcycle or a 4-cylinder, then you're not going to use these, obviously, because you're going to use the A harness. So you can use these gray wires to activate other things, such as a nitrous output must go to a relay, fuel pump output, shift lights, things like that. If it's an LED shift light, you can run it directly off of the ECU. You don't have to have a relay for an LED light. Now, if you're not going to use these gray wires, and mostly on a 550, I don't use them, so I take them out. Okay, how do you depin this connector? On the bottom side of the connector, you have a long white bar. Push that white bar in, it pops the 2 white smaller bars at the top, and it unlocks the connector. And you can pull these wires out one by one. Don't grab all 4 and pull them out. Don't grab 2 of them and pull them out. Grab them one by one, pull them out. Now those are disconnected. If you need them at a later date, you can put them in the trailer, you can put them in your shop, you can use those later if you want, or you can just keep them in the harness and you can run them to a extra plug. So you say you have a Deutsch plug on there that is a extra output plug. You can do that. One other thing that I usually do, can B. Usually don't use can B on a motorcycle harness. If you're watching this and you have a car, say you have a race pack dash in it. Say you like the FuelTech ECU, but you have a race pack dash in it, and you're using both dashes. I found that can B works better with a race pack dash from what I've done. I did a car last winter. I connected it to can A at first and it didn't work. Connected it can B, worked perfectly fine. So can B is just an expansion of a can A, can communication. If you're working on a motorcycle, I recommend just pulling it out, okay? And if you need it in the future, you can add it back into the harness in the future. Now we're gonna lock this connector back together by pushing on one of the white bars on the top, okay, and it locks it back. So 6 more blue outputs. We took the gray outputs out of it. Try to unwrap some spaghetti here. Now the 550 has yellow outputs. What's a yellow output? A yellow output can be 12 volts output or ground. Can be either 12 volts or ground. Everything else that I've talked to you up until this point is always a ground output. A blue, a gray ignition output, all ground. So if you were to connect a relay to a blue or a gray wire, it is always going to activate the relay with a ground signal. So you would send switch 12 volts or something else to the relay constant, and your output will turn it on. It will complete the circuit and turn it on. With a yellow, can be either or. I never, can't stress this enough, never activate a nitrous solenoid off of a yellow. I also never activate a gear shift output off of a yellow. Okay? Gear shift output is something to your shift solenoid. You can, however, and I have a previous video, so go back into my videos, and I have a video on how to wire a shift solenoid. Shift solenoid, you can take a blue output, any blue output. Any blue output can be labeled as anything you want, as long as an output. Any input can be labeled anything you want, as long as it's an input. So on a shift solenoid, and I explained this more in a previous video, so go back, look, subscribe. You can take a blue output, label it gear shift output, and you can take a yellow output and label it RPM activated output. So you can send a yellow 12 volt signal off a RPM activated output. Say you put it at 1,000 RPMs. Anytime that the motorcycle or vehicle is running at over 1,000 RPMs, this output will be active and be sending 12 volts. It'll be constant 12 volts. When your gear shift output gets activated, such as off of a auto shift or a button shift, then it will send a ground and it will complete the circuit. You can have the RPM activated output whatever you want. You can have it at 10,000 RPMs, you can have it at 5,000 RPMs, or whatever you want. As long as it's below the shift RPM, you're good to go. So go back earlier videos and check that out. You have 2 black ground wires. There is no 12 volt wire in the B harness for a 550. Black wires directly to the battery negative. Can't stress it enough. Battery negative. On a 550, you have 14 inputs. So it doubles the amount of inputs off of a 450. 7 on a 450, you have 7 on a 550B harness, so it doubles it. Now, there is 5 blank white wires here that can be labeled as any input that you want. There are 2 more twisted with a sensor ground. Sensor ground is a black with a sorry. Sensor ground is a green with a black striped wire. You have two that are twisted with two white wires, and you have a 10-foot unterminated one. Same with the 5-volt. You have to splice it off to each other. Okay, you can have 1,000 sensors on your vehicle or your motorcycle, whatever it may be. You splice it off of this. This ground does not have to go back to the battery. It gets battery ground through these black wires. One of the black wires, okay? So when you take these black wires straight to the battery, that's the sensor ground, okay? You do not have to do pin number 26. It's the last pin on this connector that does not go back to the battery. Now, why is this twisted like this? It has gear sensor on it. Okay, gear sensor is for a sequential shifter in a car that plugs into this connector. For a motorcycle, if you're watching this and you putting this on a motorcycle, don't need this, okay? What I do with it, just cut it off. Throw it away, you don't need it. All right? I typically use these two wires because they are shorter and they're closer to the handlebars. I typically use these as my two-step and my shift button, or it could be a nitrous button, something of that sort. You can take the sensor ground, run it to one side of the switch, the button, toggle switch, whatever it may be, and then you take the white wire and go to the other side of the switch. So when the button is connected, then these two wires are connected, sends a ground signal back to the ECU, and it activates whatever you're turning on. So that's what I recommend with that. I get a lot of questions about this, and that should answer your questions. Do not need that gear sensor on a motorcycle. So I hope this is a good overview of the 450 and the 550. Now the 600 is a little bit different. The 600 on the A harness has more wires, but on the A harness, it is only outputs. You have 32 outputs on a 600, and you have a power and ground on that connector as well. So there's 34 pins on it, and you have a power and ground and 32 outputs. You have, let me think, there's 16 blues, 8 grays, and 8 yellow wires. They act the same as a 450 and a 550. On the inputs connector, on the B side, you have 20 inputs. You have your CAN A, CAN B, you have your 5 volts, you have your sensor ground, you have your cam and crank. The one thing different about cam and crank, or I should say just cam. The only thing different on the cam on the 600 harness is it is a paired wire. It's a gray shield, gray cable instead of a black cable. The black cable is still your crank. On a 600 harness, you have a gray cable, and it has a red and a white wire in it. If you have a VR sensor as a cam, then you take the red and the white wire to it. If you have a Hall effect sensor, you do not use the white wire, like I said previously on the crank sensor wiring for the other ones. So if you have a Hall effect sensor, do not use the white wire, only use the red. And that is about the only difference. Just more inputs, outputs, and they're separated on plugs, whereas the A harness and the B harness are mix matched. So I hope this was a good overview of the wiring. I hope you got a good understanding. Next video, I'm going to be doing like a MSD relay video because I sell those a lot on my stuff. I'm going to be going over how to wire the start solenoid. I'm going to be going over wiring a oil pressure sensor because that can be confusing. Wiring other sensors such as a water temperature sensor, drive shaft sensor, shock sensor, things like that. So follow along, subscribe to my channel, and let's continue to grow this, and hopefully let's educate some people. Thanks.